this situated here. Okay, you guys can grab your homeostasis PowerPoint and we will get started. Actually, you guys can turn in your books. We're going to be in the these older books for, like I said, the first few weeks until I get situated with the new ones. So, yeah, start on page 9 if you guys will open up your books and then we can follow along in there. Homeostasis. Let me share the screen with you guys. Okay. No, hopefully you guys can see that. So, homeostasis. We already talked a little bit about homeostasis. Homeo means same. Probably familiar with that term. Stasis means it stays, or like it's, I think of stays, it's like a, stable is another way to think of it, but to me, stasis is just easiest if I think stays. Like, here's another example. Hemostasis. Now my mind just went blank. Venostasis. Anyways, but I think venostasis, I think is the right word. I'm trying to think of. My brain's kind of shot today. But anyways, where blood like stays in your veins and it kind of pulls at the bottom of your legs. Homeostasis just means stays the same. So what that means is homeostasis, and I know you guys have heard this term before, but it's just the way that our body stays in its normal function. So like I said here, maintenance, so the taking care of or the care of just a stable internal environment. So it's our body's ability to just maintain normal conditions. Okay, so in order for homeostasis to take place, our body's needs have to be met. So maybe pause the video for a second if you want to. Talk about a few things that are required for our body to function, or I mean, not for our body functionally, but needs that we have that have to be met for our body to function. So you guys can pause the video for a second, talk about a few things, and then we'll come back. But when I think of things that our body's needs need to be met, we need food, we know that. We need water, absolutely. We need oxygen. I think you'll be surprised. In our lecture we talked about yesterday, the survival needs. So another thing is atmospheric pressure. We have a constant pressure that has to be met, or our lungs won't function the way that they need to. So shelter is another thing. Those are all things that play into how our body actually functions and how it's going to work. Homeostasis means that the body is functioning normally. Okay, anything that causes our body not to work, not to function normally, is called a homeostatic imbalance. Like if we're sick, we've got some kind of disease, there's something that our body is fighting against, if there's something externally that's caused problems, and so forth. And in homeostasis, every single organ system has a role. I mean, we know the appendix, we don't really have a good role for the appendix, but we can have our tonsils removed, but they still have a function. They're part of the lymphatic system, the immune system. Our gallbladder, we can have it removed, but it still has a very important function, and our body really can't function the way it's normally supposed to without it. Okay, we talked about this yesterday, levels of organization. We know atoms make molecules, molecules make cells. Typically, as far as I go, and normally in anatomy we just go from like cells to organisms, but just so you know, atoms group together make molecules, and then cells are just made of different molecules within inside of them. So cells make tissues, tissues make organs, organ systems, and then of course organisms. Okay, so control mechanisms. And you guys can actually, on your book, they start on page 10, homeostatic control mechanisms. So basically the way that our body works is it's constantly taking in information and responding to it. Or even if it's not necessarily taking in information, there's a response system to the way that everything works. So for example, when you get hot, okay, so let's say you're working out, you get really hot or you're out in the sun, temperature gets up, what do you start to do? We sweat, right? Okay, so we start to sweat, and when we sweat, that makes our body cool off. Well, that's a control mechanism. That's a way that our body tries to keep our brain functions to keep our body in homeostasis. We don't want our temperature to be 106 degrees because it's hot outside. We want our temperature to still be 98 degrees, even though it's hot outside. So homeostasis works because of how communication works in the body. And there's two of our organ systems that are basically communication systems. First is our nervous system. Second is endocrine. We know the nervous system is composed of neurons, which are cells that conduct an electrical, if you will, electrical type of message, and they can communicate with other neurons or muscles or whatever else they need to communicate with. Endocrine system functions with hormones. So whereas the nervous system, it communicates by these electrical impulses, endocrine system communicates with chemical messages or little bitty drops, if you will, think of it kind of like a drop of chemicals that travels to specific areas and makes it do things. So instead of the electrical impulse, we have these chemicals that cause changes in the body. So that's how the endocrine system basically works. There's three components of every control mechanism. We have the receptor, the control center, and the effector. Okay, the receptor is the thing that receives the message. So let's say I am standing, let's say, here, I'll use this. So I've got my notebook open, and I open it, and I accidentally pinch my finger inside the binder. Okay, well, I know that that's going to cause pain, right? So the receptor portion is that touch receptor, pain receptor in my finger that picks up that initial message. What you'll see how it says stimuli on the PowerPoint. So stimuli or a stimulus is just a change in whatever's going on. You guys have heard that word before, just in case you're not familiar with it. Stimulus is just something that changes. The stimulus in this situation is this metal pinching my finger. And that's the stimulus. If I touch a hot stove, that's my stimulus. If I look over here at this sign, it's the stimulus is this yellow pharmacy tech sign, and I'm looking at it. So in that case, my eyes, the cells in my eyes would be the receptor. Okay, so the receptor is just the portion of the body or organ or whatever that receives that initial stimulus. So constantly we have receptors going on that monitor environmental changes. So I have temperature receptors in my skin that are always taking in what temperature it is. I have pressure receptors in my feet that tell me that I'm stepping down on something. So when I step down, the pressure receptors in my feet that's receiving the message. The stimulus is my shoe or the ground or whatever. So after this particular portion receives a change, it sends information to the control center via the afferent pathway. So look really quickly in your book. Actually, let me see if I can show you guys. See if I can find a better picture of what I'm trying to talk about here. Maybe not. Okay, flip over to, hold your place there at homeostasis. Flip over to page 209, actually, in the anatomy book, in the water anatomy book. Now, we're not going to learn all the details of here what's on page 209 yet, but I do want you to look at it, and it'll just kind of gives us an overview. So we're talking about the afferent pathway. All we're saying, that is just the pathway that this message takes to get to the next part of the control mechanism. So, for example, I pinch my finger on here. The receptor is that pain neuron that picks up that message, sends it up the pathway to my brain or spinal cord. In this case, it would go to my spinal cord. So that traveling of that message up to my spinal cord is the afferent pathway. That's all I'm saying. Okay. So if you're looking on 209, see where it says receptors? There's dendrites. It says receptors. Dendrites are just a portion of this neuron or this nerve cell. So those receptors pick up the message, and then it sends, look, it says afferent transmission. That's that pathway. It's going back to the spinal cord. This big picture on the right-hand side that has like the butterfly in it, that's just the spinal cord. Okay, so we've got stimulus here, receptors, my finger, afferent pathway of my arm. Then it goes to the control center, which typically in the body, when we're talking about, at least what we're talking about, the brain and the spinal cord are your control centers. That's kind of the thinking portion of this. It takes in the message, and then it thinks about it. It figures out, what do we do next? Okay, so it determines at what point is this pain so bad that I can't stand it anymore. It determines, if we're talking about temperature and I'm picking up these, that it's hot in this room, my brain is going to decide, okay, is it so hot that we need to sweat to cool off, or is it okay right now, or what do we need to do with this information? Control center is what decides that. It's what analyzes the information, and then it decides what are we going to do about it. Okay, so in this case, this is a reflex action because this is pain. So if I pinch my finger in here, it's going to send a message up to my spinal cord. My spinal cord is going to decide what to do. That's what this type of reflex control mechanism is showing on 209. Okay, then it sends a message back down to the effector. So look, once it gets to the spinal cord, and again, this picture is not ideal for this, but you're getting an idea. They're on 209. So the control center is the spinal cord. And then we have this efferent transmission. See that red cell, that red neuron? That's the efferent pathway. So now the spinal cord has decided what to do, and now it's sending the message of what to do down this efferent pathway. And so what happens is it's giving feedback back to the stimulus. So the effector is just that last little portion. So this efferent pathway, this neuron, is actually attached to the muscles in my finger, my hand, my forearm, my bicep, and it's going to tell that message. My spinal cord sends that message to all those muscles and tells it to jerk my hand back because it hurts. So that's an example of that whole process of how that control mechanism works. So if you want to write this down, you can make you a list. This is the order in which a control mechanism works, feedback mechanism works. So number one, you have a stimulus. That's the change in the environment. For here, it's when I pinch my finger. If I'm looking at that yellow sign, it's the yellow sign. I'm stepping, it's the pressure on my foot, or it's the floor underneath my feet, whatever. So stimulus is number one. Number two in this order is the receptor. That's the thing that receives the message. Okay. Number three, it travels up the afferent pathway. And I always remember that afferent is first because A comes before E. So afferent is the first part of this section, afferent pathway. So number one, stimulus. Number two, receptor. Number three, afferent pathway. Number four is control center, where it decides what we're going to do. Five is the efferent pathway. The other way I always remember efferent and effector. Well, let me get through this first. So number five is the efferent pathway, and then last we have the effector. So whatever happens at the end of that whatever is affected to make that change. And I remember it this way too. Okay, so I remember A is afferent because it travels away from the stimulus. So you might write these down. A comes before E, so A is first. Afferent is first in this situation, but also afferent travels away from the stimulus. Okay, A for away, A for afferent. Okay, the effector is the part that puts forth the effort. So when you think about it, if this is coming back down my arm, it's going, the message is going to my muscles and telling them to contract so they can jerk my arm away. So we have the effort part, that's the muscle part of it, goes with the efferent pathway and the effector. It has the effects at the end. So those are some good ways to remember that, but you do need to know those in order, and you do need to know what each one of those mean and are. Okay, so there's two types of control mechanisms. We have negative and positive. First, we're going to talk about negative because that one is the most common. Most things in our body work on a negative feedback mechanism. So basically what happens is we receive the stimulus, and at our spinal cord or our brain, it transition into what do we need to do about this stimulus. So most things are negative. So it tells the body to stop doing whatever it's doing that's going outside of its normal parameters. So, so let's see. I'm trying to think of, well, I've got examples on here. So look, it says when under stress, the heart pumps stronger and faster, causing the blood pressure to increase. Baroreceptors monitor these increases. Baroreceptors are special cells within your blood vessels that whenever your blood vessels stretch, it causes these baroreceptors to, that's the stimulus that makes these baroreceptors kick into mode and send messages to the brain. So when our blood vessels stretch, then these baroreceptors pick up that message, sends it to our brain, and our brain sends back a message to our heart, which in turn would be the effector in that situation, and tells it to slow down so that the blood pressure can slow down some. And that's how it works. It's just a constantly our body is doing that so that it can stay in motion. That's why when you work out, your heart rate doesn't, you don't go into some crazy arrhythmia or crazy heart rhythm because you're going so fast. No, your brain is constantly telling your heart to pull it back down, slow back down a little bit. Let's keep it down so that we don't go crazy, you know, don't want to have a heart attack. So after that, blood pressure will stay normal. That's why, I mean, your blood pressure is always going to go up some during exercise, but it's not going to go up beyond what your norm should be, or it shouldn't. Otherwise, you have something going on. So, yeah, really interesting. Your hypothalamus works the same way. Your hypothalamus is a portion of your brain that regulates your temperature. So, we're running outside and we're getting really hot. Our hypothalamus, the temperature receptors in our skin, sending a message to our brain that says, hey, we're getting really hot, something's going on. So our hypothalamus says, okay, well, we need to cool off. So it sends a message to our sweat glands that tells them to release sweat glands, perspiration, tells them to release it. Well, when it does that, that moisture on our skin causes our skin to cool off, and then that helps us, that's why we sweat, it helps us to cool off. So those are examples of negative. It tries to do the opposite of whatever the stimulus is doing. Okay, this is negative. If I stick my finger in here and I pinch it, it's a negative because my body is going to automatically send a message back to my hand to get rid of that stimulus because it hurts. Okay, positive feedback mechanisms actually do the opposite. They actually tell the body to keep up with the stimulus, to keep causing the stimulus so that it can keep going. And there's two main positive feedback mechanisms, but these are really rare in the body. One is during birth. Contractions are an example of a positive feedback mechanism. So it says when contractions begin to push the baby into the birth canal, the pressure of the baby in the birth canal is stimulated to increase the contractions. So even though the stretching of the birth canal, that's stretching and there's pain there, the contractions in the uterus keep pushing the baby further down the birth canal. That's a positive feedback because it increases the stimulus. So the contractions are the stimulus because they cause the stretching of the birth canal, but then the message goes back to the uterus to keep doing the contractions and to increase them and keep pushing and getting harder and harder and worse and worse and more painful until the baby's all the way out. So that's an example of positive. Okay, it makes the stimulus keep going. Negative makes the stimulus stop. Another example of positive feedback is blood clotting. Remember, like my picture in the notes of the guy getting stabbed. So there's a whole lot to the blood clotting process that we'll learn later in the year. But one of the ways that works is that we start bleeding, and all these clotting factors. There's, like I said, there's a whole lot that goes into it. But we have platelets that head there, and one of the things that happens, those platelets are sticky cells that cause blood to clot. Well, when that happens, it sends back a message to our brain and everywhere else. There's a lot of hormonal messages, but anyways, that go on with blood clotting, and it just keeps sending platelets or keeps sending clotting factors until the clot's completely stopped. So that's another example. Pretty interesting. Like I said, nervous and endocrine systems, move this down a little bit, work together or independently. So they do a little bit of both to deliver the signals that cause any kind of corrections to occur so that we can stay in homeostasis. Electrical messages are the nervous system. Chemical messages are your hormones and endocrine system. Okay, so last few things on here. So ways that we gain heat. So if we're specifically talking about heat, our body's trying to keep up with temperature regulation. Okay, metabolism is one way. And we know, we think of some people have higher metabolism than others, and that's probably the case. Muscle contraction. So that's why whenever you exercise, okay, your heart rate gets up, more metabolism, you burn fat, you burn your sugars, but it also causes heat. It's why you get hot when you work out. Other metabolic activities cause us, so when we eat, that causes an increase in body temperature. Kind of interesting. And then, of course, environmental changes. That's a way we can gain heat. And I'm just talking about these temperature changes. You can go back to the book now. I don't even think these are in. I think I added these later on because I think they're good to know. Anyway, so methods of gaining heat. So those are ways we can gain heat. That's when we work out, our body, muscles, any kind of muscles that are working make heat. That's why we shiver. When we're cold, our body says, okay, how can we warm up? Our hypothalamus does. Cold is the stimulus. The temperature receptors in our skin are the receptor, travels up the afferent pathway to our brain, the control center, our hypothalamus, that part of the brain that regulates temperature. And it says, okay, we're cold, we need to warm up somehow. So then that sends messages back down to all of our muscles and causes them to start shaking and shivering. Well, the shivering causes that muscle contraction that generates heat. Whoops. Lost one. Okay, ways that we lose heat. These four, and you need to know the difference in these four things. Okay? So evaporation converts liquid water to a vapor. So breathing is one way that we might consider that. Make sure. Let me grab something really quickly. I forgot to get my PowerPoint out, and sometimes if I don't look at my PowerPoint, and if I have notes in there for you guys, then I might miss something that would be on the test. So make sure you get all the info that you need. One here before I keep going. Maybe. Sorry. Should have had it out already, but And maybe I don't have it in here at all. I'm sorry. Well, I guess I might find it later. I have one with notes on it somewhere, but apparently not in here. Okay. Anyways, so evaporation converts liquid water to vapor is one way. Conduction. So this is evaporation would be like sweating is another example of that. Conduction is direct contact between objects. So, for example, let's say I put an ice cube in my mouth, and that's going to help me to cool off a little bit. Or you put ice on your head, that's going to help you cool off. You get in front of, that's not an example. That's pretty easy. Convection is conduction where it's the same thing as conduction. So you touch something, but one thing is in motion. So one example of convection would be like you go stand in front of a fan and air is moving across your skin. That's convection. That makes sense? So like cold wind would be convection. Radiation is loss of heat to the environment due to a temperature gradient. So we lose, the temperature goes down outside, we get cold. Pretty simple. Make sure you get conduction and convection squared up in your mind because you will be asked those questions later. Ways that our body cools off: sweating, like I said, dermal blood vessel dilation. You guys ever noticed that whenever you work out, your blood vessels tend to like bulge out and you can see them really well? Well, one of the reasons that is one, they're dilated because your pressure's already up, so it increases their size. But the other thing is it actually helps to cool off the body because that blood is closer to the surface of your skin and it's able to lose more heat. Ways that our body warms itself: shivering, like I said a while ago, involuntary reactions, muscle movement, and then dermal blood vessel constriction. So those blood vessels actually shrink down and kind of pull inside more to hold in heat. You guys may not have been aware of that. Okay, done. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I will see you. I will see you soon next week.